Dubois was an illegal trader, okay, in quotes, illegal trader in the Illinois country. In those days, and this will probably warm all of our hearts to know that human nature doesn't change. You needed a license, which in French was called a license to trade. Now, to get one, you usually had to have money, power, influence. Many times, a person with money would get the license and then hire off people to go and do the dirty work for them. And to get a license, you usually had to bribe your way into these things if you didn't have influence at the court of Louis. So, as is today, when you want to meet the right people, or you want to, like in government business today, you know how that goes occasionally when you know the right people and you schmooze them and you wind up like you're inking a contract for big dollars. Well, human nature has changed. And the Coureur de Bois, their philosophy was there's money to be made. Nobody's going to catch us once we're out there, so why not? And it's very true. Now, once they were out in the wild, it was very hard to track them down and catch them. The money to be made was very, very good. What Coureur de Bois happened to do in this period of time as they ran out of the woods, they literally evolved more Native American or Indian than Indian. They literally became wild men of the range. They were not, woods runner is a nice term. They went out in the woods, lived off the land, got the beaver skins, which were what was called the soft brown gold, and they would get their money. And there's a story of them marching back on a summer day to Montreal, which was the center of the fur trade, naked down the middle of the street. Because out in the woods, living with Native Americans in the summertime, it was common to go around with nothing more than either a breechcloth or nothing for the Native Americans. So that was their way of almost, and when they came to town, it was like the old cowboy movies, if you recall, when the cattle drive, they all came to town. You know, the town was terrorized. Okay, that's the Hollywood version. I don't know the authenticity of that. But when the Coureurs came back to Montreal, the people couldn't wait for them to leave again. They went wild. It was like they were one fling back in what was called civilization, back to the woods. But what I would like to do today, this outfit is just an outfit, and I'm certainly not going to be sticking to do with this. In fact, you know, to do all of this thing. No, I would like to go into the culture of Native Americans of our area. Some people here have seen the movie, Kevin Costner again.
Dances with Wolves.
Dances with Wolves. From a technical standpoint, the clothing, the lodges, everything, that's very accurate. But the movie was kind of a fudging, moving a story from the southwestern Indians up to the plains. And it was also in a time period that the Indians were long in contact with the European culture. So you did not have the same type of culture. You had a culture that already had been through all this flux and probably was now in many ways more European than Native American. What I would like to talk about is the culture that we had here with the eastern woodland Indians of the late Mississippian period, which is just pre-contact, just before the contact, and some of the things that contact did to them. We're talking about tribes like the Kickapoo, the Sauk, the Fox, the Potawatomi, the Prairie Potawatomi, and what was, they were called also the Mascoutins, the Forest Potawatomi, the Winnebagos, and the Nominee, okay, the Ottawa, the Miami, the Illinois Confederacy. These are the tribes, and even for a period, the Shawnee up here. They are all, for the most part, save for the Winnebagos, which were Sioux-speaking, they're all Algonquin-speaking tribes. And they, at one time or another, either inhabited parts of our area or had some influence on them. And I'll even include into that the Seneca Iroquois, because the Iroquois Confederacy, which consisted of 5 tribes, then moved to 6, and then up to 7, the Seneca Iroquois had a big influence in some of the things that happened here, simply because they were so feared that they laid siege on the Illinois Confederacy and on some of the other tribes, and literally drove the Illinois at one point across the Mississippi River, and they were stuck in the common ground of their old enemy, the Sioux. So what I'm going to talk about is this culture, and it's sometimes when we talk about Native Americans pre-contact and using the word culture, it's almost like contradiction in terms, because most people don't think they had a culture. They simply were savages that lived in the wild, okay? And the French, when they first saw them, their only word to describe them was sauvage, S-A-U-V-A-G-E. They didn't, that was the only word. So you might see on the map, the early French map, pas de sauvage. anybody has been following the Columbus presentation on Channel 11, it's an excellent show. I highly recommend it if you can tape it for later. It's a great resource for later. Columbus, you know, had no real words to describe these people. He was dressed in one. He had, I believe, he had brought with him a Chinese silk robe because he thought he was going to meet up with them again. Well, something kind of interesting to that same extent. I believe it was Cartier. It may have been Lassalle and Cartier. When Cartier came here in 1534, he sailed up St. Lawrence to Montreal Island and then to a place called Lachine, which he named Lachine. Lachine meant China. He thought that on the other side of these rapids, the Lachine Rapids outside of the western end of Montreal Island, were a very, very rugged set of about 50 rapids, and there's a good story that will work in there later. He thought that crossing those rapids may be the passage to China, so he called it the Lachine Rapids. Interesting how both parties, you know, being somewhat like 42 years different, still were in that same, one was looking for a northwest passage, one was looking for a western passage, and so both were sort of mixed up. But when we talk about the culture, I think the first thing I would like to, and this just hit me because of today, there was a little snippet in the national news, and this really was chilling. I was sitting there, and it was a story of child abuse in this country, and what happened was it was a crisis hotline where a boy was calling. He was calling and asking for help from a child abuse crisis hotline. At the time, his father found it out, and literally they had recorded this father beating him. And what made me think was that most of the records of the Jesuit priests, they mentioned that Native American parents were highly tolerant of their children. In other words, they had much latitude of behavior. And what makes this so incongruous to me is that we always call them savages. Yet in many ways, they treated their children better than we do today. Now, seeing this thing on TV, it just, you feel like you wish you could be there doing something to help it, but it was a chilling thing listening to this kid being beaten. And it just made me think of that, how we are so smug today as we're a civilized society, and they were just savages we had to reform. If you saw Columbus, you saw that the objective of Columbus was glory, power, and money. The objective of the priests that came with him was to capture their souls, because when the Jesuits came to North America, they felt that these people were wayward, needing their souls to be brought back, that they were not really enjoying any religious quality. And so you had an interesting thing. And the Jesuits probably had as big an influence on the culture as traders. And it's interesting. I don't know if I have the book, and usually there is a passage in one of the books, a direct copy of Jesuit Relations, that talks about how the Jesuits had an influence on these people. And one of the biggest influences was, this passage says, we saw them walking naked, unashamed of their nakedness. We knew that this was not right. Over time, we made them realize that their nakedness was an act of glory, of the God, and from that point on, they started to change. A very big change. That little item of making them ashamed of their nakedness that wreaked a chain reaction of changes, because what happened was, as people started to become ashamed of their nakedness, those that were still naked had a problem with peer pressure and what we call today politically correct. And what was happening was the Jesuits were influencing certain people. These people then were influencing the other people, and eventually they felt that walking around in the summer naked was no longer a proper thing to do. Total change in culture. That is a big change. It's as big a change as a material goods change. But I thought I'd give you a perspective of what was happening back then from a few things. One, maybe from a standpoint of technology. And this will interest the women, I think, mostly, because, believe it or not, I'll just name you some of the tasks performed by women in the tribe. Skinning animals, cutting up and drying the meat, getting the firewood, making the lodge, transporting the lodge, taking care of the children, making the clothes, making the thread for the clothing, tending the gardens, probably sundry other tasks. Now, the men's basic tasks were hunting, fishing, some of the more muscular tasks that obviously women more physical capable of performing, smoking, war councils, and laying around for a while. Hollywood had shortchanged females in history, and especially Native American females, because Have you ever seen a movie that concentrated on a Native American woman as the backbone of a tribe? Probably, you may have seen some points, but nothing that's concentrated on that. They were literally the backbone of the tribe. But Hollywood doesn't find that very interesting. So the movies we get almost always center around warfare. This is the generic Indian that Hollywood has given me as a boy, and probably many of you. Ugly. Oh, any moon since we saw. Really a bunch of, well, using an Irish term, blarney. First of all, the word how in Algonquian had no meaning. I don't even know where it came from. The hand sign had meaning. It meant, and it's very understandable, probably universally, that I come as a friend without a weapon, open palm hand. The Uggs, I don't know where that ever came from. I have to assume it sounded good in some scriptwriter's imagination at one point, and Uggs became popular. And probably the man who best personified the generic Indian, J. Silverhead, a full-blooded Indian, forced to play Hollywood Indian all his life. I think what happened to him in many ways was that in the Native American community, he somewhat was discredited because they realized that he was playing this Hollywood Indian, this generic Indian that never really existed, you know, the compilation of every culture throughout North America. But those are just some of the things I grew up with. The only Indian, you remember the General Sheridan's quote, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And John Wayne was picking them off left and right, you know. They always showed the Indians rushing headlong into a volley of fire, getting wiped out, moving back and rushing headlong back into it. They were a lot smarter than that, but, you know, it's tough to break what you learn or what you take in as a child and process as information is very hard to break as an adult. I grew up just watching the Uggs in the house, and I thought every Indian lived in a teepee, and, you know, they all dressed the same, they all ate the same things, and then suddenly, one day I learned the opposite. I myself am not a Native American. That sometimes causes consternation, not amongst the Native American people themselves, amongst people who would rather be told this from a Native American. And I justify this from a couple of standpoints. One, I do know what I'm talking about, at least I feel that from enough time. And two, if you were to criticize me for talking about Native American culture as it was, and keyword being was, then what about an Englishman who studies Egyptology, or a Frenchman who studies ancient Greece? If your credibility lies in your genetic link, then, you know, it seems. But I don't speak to being a modern Native American. There are plenty of modern Native Americans who speak to that very well. I don't talk about that. I don't know what it's like to be a modern Native American in this society. But that is sometimes people want to be told this by a Native American. And so I try to bring that out forthright at first, so that you don't think that I'm trying to hide behind this outfit. But I thought I'd start with some of the technology of the time. And here's another one of those words that sounds like a contradiction, technology, but here's some of the technology. This would be very germane to the females in the audience. That's a skinning knife, or a gutting knife. Of the time, it's a stone knife made of flint with an antler handle with hide glue wrapped in rock. The animal would many times be tied by the legs over a tree branch and then gutted. And you would start slicing for the skin and then use your hands. As anybody who's skinned an animal knows, the hands are as good as a tool for when the skin starts peeling off. They would have to literally gut the animal and make sure the skin quality was intact, cut the meat off, smoke and dry the meat, save the bones, and then start working on the clothing, because the women made all the clothing. You can see now that this is never shown in movies, all the work that they done. They would start the clothing making by having to get rid of the hair off of the hide, and there were a couple ways of doing it. Occasionally they used what was called a beaming board, which was a board on a couple of legs laid on about, say, a 45-degree angle. And this would go over it, the fur, and then they would take another one of the tools of the trade. This is a shaving tool. They would first flesh off the blood and guts. And there's a couple of types of fleshing tools. They flesh off the blood and guts. Then they would have to scrape the hide with this, literally shave off most of the hair. So this item became the shaving tool. It's a deer shoulder bone or scapula used for a scraper. And you can imagine how long this took just for one individual hide. And it took more than one hide to make a shirt or a skirt or a breechcloth, leggings, all of this. This is a section of moose hide. And obviously moose is not native to our area, but some man's wife was threatening to throw him out. He gave this to me, and I use it as a demo. The kids, when we do this work with kids, we give them the tool, them to work. This is their handiwork. This is children just with this bone tool. They've done a nice job. If my kids had far enough gone, I'd probably be able to use it. But they stopped. This was only the start. Getting the hair off, getting the blood and guts off. And of course, doing it without damaging the skin, because that skin was the key. You didn't want to wear a shirt with moose hair all over it. I guarantee you, it won't be a pleasant experience. But once you've done that, you've got to do a few things. One, you've got to stretch your hide, because you want the maximum amount of surface area for what you're getting. So you sew and you stretch the hide, and you stretch the hide. You may stake it down even, you stretch it. Because what you're trying to do is not have to do 3 of these if you don't have to. But probably the most unique thing, or I don't know if you can have most unique, but probably the unique thing about it is they discovered that the brain of the animal would tan the hide. And the woman would have to take, usually it was a hammerstone, one probably that fits the individual person's hand. This is a hammerstone. And bust the skull open, take out the brain, put it in, normally the bowl was something like this, a gourd bowl, because pre-contact in our area, there was no metal. Get the brain in here, mix it with some water, and then rub it on both sides of the skin. Because what they were doing, they were coating the skin fibers with oil from the brain. Much like when we have dry skin, and we rub in skin lotion, we were coating the fibers of our skin. That was to coat the fibers of the skin so that it would become soft, and see if we have a hunk of the material here. Let's see, this material here, which is a pillow, by the way. Oddly enough, Western people didn't invent the pillow. They would coat the fibers so it would be soft, and then they would start working on the sewing part. If they failed to do that, this is what you get if you don't tan it. You get raw cartilage. You can imagine a breechcloth made of this. Little scorpion. However, this was one of those universal and a multitude of uses, but that was brain tanning. Now you can, that process there probably took a day, and they were nowhere near a shirt. After that, they had to kind of go along, and after brain tanning, you had to wash it, then you had to stretch it again, then you rubbed it to get the softness back in it, and you had then to start cutting and sewing. And of course, you didn't have thread. What you did, you took the tendons of the animal. This is called back sinew, deer back sinew. The back tendons that run along the spine. They took them out, and the process, using the bone or the stone knife, they would get just behind it, start slicing and cutting, get your fingers in, and start pulling the sinew down off the long back sinew, because the longer piece you got, the easier it was to sew. Once you got it off, you had to start busting up the bundle sheets that hold these together with a rock on a hard surface, and they would just start pounding. And slowly but surely, getting thinner and thinner pieces. Do you see almost like thread coming out of this? If you can, this is thread. This would take quite a bit of time, effort, and then to slice the thread is very tricky. This was the thread of its time. Now, how they came about brain tanning this, obviously it had to be through just, it was not unique to the 1600 Native Americans. This goes back probably to prehistoric man, as far back as, we have no record of it. But this was the thread, and yet, again, we have not come to anything, after the man dropped that hunted animal off, we haven't come to anything they've been doing yet, because they haven't been doing anything. After the thread was done, they had to then get themselves, make a few more tools, if they didn't already have them. One was an awl. They had to punch the holes in the leather to sew it. And normally the shirts made for men usually were loosely sewn along the arms, and then just tied with cord here. Because there are times when if you were hunting or if you needed use of your full extent of your arms, you could untie and unlace the cord and toss the sleeve out under. And along the sides, it wasn't sewn normally. It was just corded with thongs. So that you had a loose shirt, very loose. There was no great tailoring of the time. Very loose thing, but very functional shirt. But to get through the leather, you had to have a sharp instrument. This is a bone awl. It's nothing more than a filed deer bone. And when they made tools out of deer bones, they literally had to leave the bone. You look for the fracture lines, because the fracture lines are going to tell you where the hammer is. Start working on a sliver or a piece that's going to eventually look like this. You take your hammerstone, hit it along the fracture lines. Once you've got your piece, you start using your sandstone. And can you imagine the time consumed in filing this down on sandstone? Imagine how long just to get one of these. So this was how they had to know how to literally read that bone. Because if you just smash it with the hammer in the wrong place, you get a bunch of tiny little bones, which is great for a dog if you have them. They did have them, yes.
What is the fracture line? Is that something that they created when they
No.
found it, or is that...
In every bone, normally you can see either suture lines or fracture lines. Just like in a skull, is a bunch of fused plates. This, you can, I'll pass this bone around and take a look and you'll see fracture lines in it. Once they punched it through with this, they had to use needles. And again, needles of bone. The sinew would be attached and sewn through with this, a bone needle. Again, the women made this. Just a little notch. Now, there have been diggings in Kaskaskia area, which is now Utica today. They've dug up some that have a sort of eye to them. However, I've never read it described in any of the history books that had it on it. But if they dug it up there, it obviously had significance. But all that was needed was a notch in the side to pass it through. Now this is just one type, one shape. Here's another longer, flatter one for a different style of work. When they were making cord nets for fishing, they used wood needles. So there were all kinds of, this is nothing more than another bone. And this one was used in a little bit more unique way, which was using that more unique. Let's just say a different way. But that was just the start. Another piece of technology, if you're going to smoke the hide, and smoking the hide did not waterproof the hide, contrary to popular fiction today. It made the hide more water resistant, did not waterproof it. If you stayed out long enough in the hide, it would penetrate. They would take the hide and sometimes take a tripod, wrap the hide around the tripod with an opening on the top, and let the smoke from the fire just sort of go in and then turn the hide around the other way. And the hide would sort of yellow, and the smoke would impart a water resistance to the hide, but not waterproofing it. But to get the firewood, they had to go out with this. The hand axe. And most times you see this, it's attached to a handle, and they're saying that this was how they chopped wood. Well, for the most part, if you ever attach one of these to a handle and tried to chop an oak tree, it would be 2 or 3 chops later, and you would not have the handle. The way the big trees were felled back then was to burn. Chop the char away, burn it again. Chop the char away. Because the only thing this could really chop was the chop. Fresh oak, if anybody's ever tried to fell an oak tree with a big metal axe, you know that that's a long process. Well, this was a hand axe. It's a piece of granite which, using what's called a pecking stone, to flake it down, and then sandstone to get your smoothness, and sandstone again to rub it into an edge. This was a woman's tool, and this could have been, this in close combat could be a war club. But for the most part, it was a utilitarian tool, and there were many sizes and shapes. This also functioned as a hammer. But if you, I'll pass it around. Just feel the edge. It has an edge to it. Yes. This is. I'm trying to figure where I got that piece from. Somebody gave it. But some of the other tools of the trade again, very common. Good question?
Yes.
From a local newspaper. Can you hold up something large for
Hold your chin up.
kind of show it? I know, I hate to interrupt.
That's
you,
okay, let's see, is there something large
but-
and,
Is that a word or?
a what? The skin? Okay, let's,
Skin, yeah, that's good. And maybe show it to these women in the front row.
okay, I was gonna shed on you, you know. That's why that woman threw it out.
Look up at her, Lou.
Yeah, she didn't want any part of this thing. She brought him in to the place I worked and literally made him give it away. She was short. She wanted to be short, so she went right with it. Sure. Well, the spray pig will eventually do that. That's why the women had to be so doggone careful. But this high doesn't relate to our area. In the Illinois country, which includes, now I come from Minooka, Illinois, which is not far from the Illinois River Valley area. The description of that area in the 1600s had black bear, cougar, wolf, elk, all there. Okay, now, fairly obvious that none of that is there, but you can see the area's richness as far as from a natural standpoint is very, very, very well, very good at that point. But some of the unusual tools, this is mentioned in one of the pieces in Jesuit Relations. This was mentioned as being seen upon one of the members of the Illinois Confederacy. It is a chest bone dagger. It is a deer leg bone sharpened on a sandstone with nothing more than a rawhide wrap. It's one of those you might call mild utilitarian knives. In other words, for something that wasn't that difficult to do, like just to quickly cut some cord or do this. This is what was carried. And not only deer leg bones, buffalo, elk, fairly obvious, a lot of bones serve the same purpose. But this is you're looking at sort of the cutlery of its time. And again, the shape and size of this knife is no indication of, it's not a standardized thing. There were various shapes and sizes. Some literally had the rock running this far with no handle. The rock itself was a handle, the large. And the thing about knives like this is they lose their sharpness rather quickly, and you have to keep replacing them. And if you drop it on a hard surface, you have a bunch of little knives all of a sudden. So it's a much harder thing to deal with. And again, a few more of the things that were of the time. Something that we take totally for granted today, rope. Now this was an area where women had to be busy all the time making rope. And I have here 3 types of the rope made here. There were more than what I have. This is a rope made of inner bark of a willow tree, of the sandbar willow. It's a twisted rope. Now I'll pass the ropes along. This is a cattail leaf rope. The good old cattail that grows all around here. That is another type of rope. This is a basswood inner bark rope. Probably of the 3, the most quality rope. This is only short section. This is probably spliced in about 2 places. Some of those are spliced in 4 or 5 places. But the women would sit around doing this. The tasks were endless because the tasks were survival themselves. So that you didn't say, I'm going to take a week off and, I'm not doing this, I'm going to take a week off or relax. No, that it wasn't available to them. The women were doing, you can see already what we're talking about. Skinning the animal, drying the meat, making the clothes, making the thread, making the tools, making the rope, taking care of the children. You can see, I don't know, has it gotten any better? I don't want to I'll pass this one around too. This is basswood. And I think I have a hunk of this here. Let's see if I can demonstrate to you how this was done. They would peel the bark, usually in the spring, when you've got a nice flexible cord. And the object was to separate inner from outer. And I probably separated this all too much, but what they would do is find a sharp edge and break how the inner from outer is coming out of them. Now, this is old stuff, not very valuable anymore. But this would be separated. After it was separated, then we'll use something that's very familiar to you here. We use cattail leaf. After, what they did was, depending on the size of the rope, they would just split it. And let's get and simply, you can start a rope. And it's so easy, it's unbelievable. You always, when you're going to make a rope of any size, this they learned early, never splice both slices at the same place, because your weakness is doubled there. You stagger your joints, much like brick masons and everything. So you would maybe start something like this, and the rope was a simple twist. You simply twisted both ends towards you, looped them over, twisted both ends towards you, and looped them over, and just, you can see in a second we're forming a rope out of this. What makes this interesting is now, if you can, you probably, I'll pass it on, but notice how it's not helicoptering on me. What I was doing was, I'm basically twisting the fiber bundles of the plant tight together. But to balance the tension that I'm putting on these, I'm twisting them towards me both, but when I turn them around each other, I turn them the opposite way to balance it all. So that when I'm done, they're not doing to nothing. And this is hard. When I teach this to people today, this is the hardest point for them to grasp. They'll twist both ends, and then they'll twist it back the same way. And they'll hold tight on the rope, and then about 7 twists down, they'll hold it up, and it will, and it's gone. And they would get to a point where they would then splice. And splicing was the job of feathering. You feathered this piece, say you were going to splice this piece, you feathered the other end in, and you feathered it up as far, about 4, 5, 6 inches, and then you started doing the same thing again. Then your next splice down here, so that they were always alternating. And when you pulled on the rope, you did not have 2 weak joints at the same place, otherwise you would have, again, a bunch of little ropes. But cattail leaf, it's as simple as that, and if anybody wants to try it, I have some here. You're welcome to. That again will fell to the women. Some of the types of cordage you had, the basswood bark, probably the strongest individual cordage was called dogbane. If you've ever seen, they have long, thin green pods with a red stem. They grow on railroad embankments all the time now. They give out a milky white juice when the plant is bruised. That is still common here today. The tensile strength, and tensile strength is nothing more than pulling in parallel direction, fibers moving parallel. Tensile strength of dogbane is said to be stronger than steel. That was one. Now the one that is probably the neatest to work with, once you get over the problems with it, is nettle. Stinging wood nettle. Okay. In the fall, you can go out and harvest wood nettle. In our area, stinging nettle is not a common plant. Wood nettle is, which if you've ever walked in a floodplain area with shorts on, and all of a sudden start feeling little burning marks. Well, stinging nettle is a great fiber, super strong, but when you get it, you've got to get off the little stingers on it, and that's the key. Once you've got that, you can start processing it and almost make it like a flax. The fibers of it, you can get that long, flaxy look to it, very strong. But that's another one. And also, another thing used was thong as a cordage. Just the skin ripped into small pieces. And probably, let's see if we can find it over here. This is softened rawhide. I'll pass this around. It's softened by pounding it with the hammerstone when it's wet. What you're doing again is separating fibers. You're trying to take something that normally dries rock hard, and by pounding it, like with the sinews, separate the fibers out, soften it, and you've made a rope. Now this was a lot easier to make in many ways, but still you had to go through the skinning process. That was just another one of the cordages used here. And along with, well, I think this is kind of neat because I think it shows ingenuity here. This is sort of what you might call a technological breakthrough. The original fire making started out with banging 2 rocks together with a nest of material to get a spark. So you would go something like this. You get your nest there, and you hit your rock. Highly unreliable method of fire making. Very difficult. In fact, if your life depended on it, you probably would be the former Native American. It was not an easy thing to master. And again, in any culture, the technology is readily adaptable the easier it is to master. It's like with computers. As computers get more user-friendly, more people go to them. When in their infancy, computers in the 50s, 60s were only basically meant for scientists, mathematicians, those types of people. For most people, they were not user-friendly. They weren't even meant to be user-friendly. And the same with any piece of technology. The more user-friendly it is, the more we will take to it. And what happened was, they moved up a notch into the hand drill, which was taking friction, just another type of friction fire, which banging two rocks together with. And what the object was to continually go up and down until you got a hot coal of fire. Now, again, this took something to master. Normally, you had to have very good dexterity to do this. Again, not user-friendly. Not everyone could master it. And again, another technology that was more specialized because every person couldn't take to it. So what happened a little bit later on was, and this is probably one of the bigger, what I call technological breakthroughs, was the addition of a few minor things. The addition of a bow with a piece of power flesher. Instead of that hand drilling, you now just took this, put it here, and turned this. And I could do this on the ground, but then nobody would see it. Suddenly, almost anybody could make a fire. The reliability just went up, probably geometrically. And it was user-friendly. More people could do it. Probably a girl or boy at the age of 6, 7 years old was already mastering this process, which they might not have been able to have the dexterity to master the rocks or the hand drill. So suddenly, and to us, we don't, most of us living in the modern 20th century do not see this as a technological breakthrough because we've seen some of the greatest of all time, but yet this was. And nobody knows who thought of it, what or where, but it actually was. And it made fire making easy. The only thing you had to do then was to catch your hot coal of fire, put it in a nest, blow on it. And I guarantee you that once you learn this process, it takes 15 seconds to start a fire. It is a matter of process.
Yeah, you know, I saw a demonstration of that, just that kind of thing in television that was in Hawaii. So I guess there's must have been discovered all over the world.
Exactly. It has no inventor, and as Americans, we like to trace things back to an origin, but we want the origin to be invested in an individual person already. We say Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. He had 500 guys working with him day and night. What he did mostly, he had persisted. His 500 people were trying something new all the time. Okay, we imbue in individuals what maybe they don't deserve at all times. We want one person to have credit for something. So we say Ford invented this or Edison invented that because we don't feel comfortable saying, well, it was a group of people here who did this. We want specifics. So with this, there is no specifics. It's fairly obvious. We don't know who was the first person to brain pan. It could have gone back to, the Tigris and Euphrates River way back in ancient times. We don't know. But from our standpoint, it's hard probably to fathom that this was a technological breakthrough. And yet, again, just added a bow. I don't see technology there, but yet it was. Another bit of technology, and again, this was a male and female thing here, was drilling holes. Another thing we take for granted today. Well, they didn't have metal, so they were forced to take stone and make drill bits. Black & Decker of its time, right here. At first, again, what they had for drilling was the hand drill. You can imagine this. How many hours a person might take to drill one hole through one piece of stone or bone. Okay. It was intense. And probably at the end of doing this, you were so tired and frustrated that you probably retired to your wigwam and said, okay, that's I need a break. But what made this interesting was, later on, they took this, added this. Now suddenly we've got a power drill. But they even went one better. At in the fur trade, when metal was introduced into this area, they would take old nails, pound them out of rock. And now we're talking about a supreme power drill. With a cap, you can drill through a piece of wood with this in a short time. So they actually took something from another culture and adapted it to their own culture to make drilling holes. This, in essence, is a power. You know the hand drills we use. I use this as a boy. I'm sure a lot of you use it. Okay, this kind of parallels that in many ways. The only thing is the materials are different. Here's a power drill. So we've got another leap of technological innovation here. it looks very mundane from our standpoint after watching voyagers travel through the planet. But at the time, these are big breakthroughs in technology. And it just, it changed a lot about the culture. Some of the probably more unusual things, and something that I don't know if we give them credit for, they were really great in agriculture in this area. When LaSalle first came here, and LaSalle was given short shrift in history books because he failed. And this guy here is hanging down on me, it's banging on me. I thought there was something down here. You could, if you wanted to make a case for this, you could take Columbus and LaSalle and follow them, and you will see parallel paths, parallel objectives. Columbus's plan was to sail to the Far East, bring the Christian faith, build forts, take back the goods. LaSalle's idea was to create an empire in mid-America, with which he would command from none other than Iraq, which in 1690 or 1683 was Fort St. Louis, long before it was Iraq. He had gathered with him there, under his protection, 20,000 Indians or Native Americans of various tribal origins, including the Shawnee at that time. And he had promised them protection from the Seneca and from their enemies. What he was doing was building an empire of the fur trade where he would ship his goods downstream instead of back up to Quebec because he had enemies up there. And he had planned to build an empire. But what was kind of curious is, just as Columbus's navigational techniques were slightly off, he wound up south of his destination and far away from where he thought he was. LaSalle, on his voyage back to rediscover the mouth of Mississippi, measured 1/2 of 1 degree off of longitude, which put him in a place called Matagorda Bay instead of the mouth of the Mississippi. He was going to the mouth of the Mississippi to establish the terminus of his fur trade empire. And that 1/2 of 1 degree caused him to lose his life, to lose all money, all faith, everything. If he had measured that properly, it's just entirely possible today we could be French speaking. But that 1/2 of a degree caused him to shift into Matagorda Bay, where he spent all kinds of time hassling and lost 2 of his ships, everything on this voyage that could have gone wrong. Murphy's Law hit him like a ton of bricks. On the way back, after all this struggle in what he called Fort St. Louis again, down in Matagorda Bay, he established another one. He brought with him 2 people who had the highest animosity for him. On the way back, they shot him in the head on the Trinity River and left his body. They stripped his clothing off and left his body to the wolves. So it's a very interesting parallel. 2 men who, one from failure, is a big success today. Columbus, I mean, if you look at everything about it, it's a failure. He didn't get the far. He never ever stepped foot on the North American proper, or rather on United States proper. He did step on Central America, but he did everything wrong. And he's hailed throughout our country today. LaSalle, who did much right with the Native Americans and failed in his navigation, and he is totally ignored in history. If you look at history books, there may be a paragraph on him. He was more important than we give him credit for, but he's a failure, and he's also, being French. There's something that seems that French history, the French involvement in the United States it's something I don't think we've ever taken to well. The English involvement, obviously, the Spanish involvement seems to be, but we have never taken to that, which so many of our towns and cities in the Midwest have French names. You got Lac du Flambeau, Pont du Lac, Saint Genevieve, all of these places in our area, but for the children today, they're just names. They have no flesh to them. But that was an interesting thing. And I mentioned about Louis Joliet. Louis Joliet, when he came this way, he stopped over at, met with the Peoria Indians. The chief gave him slaves for his son. So he gave him something that saved his life. And see if I can find it over here. He gave him a peace pipe, a calumet. This is a pipestone pipe. They're called a calumet. Calumet is supposed to be a Norse word for reed. And most of the calumet, the reed was as important as the bowl. What happened to him is as he sailed south on the Mississippi, down in the Arkansas Territory, he came upon a tribe of Indians called the Pawnees. They were coming out to attack him. the peace pipe, which in certain parts of the Midwest, in fact, most of our Midwestern area, is like a passport. He held it up, and that was immediately recognized as a sign of that not to attack this man. It saved his life, literally. We have passports to go passing through different territories. This did not, again, you see this generically used in Hollywood movies, no matter where they're at, somebody's smoking a peace pipe. The calumet did not have significance throughout the United States. It had regions where it was understood, but it was not generally the pipe. You didn't. In other words, if you walked into California with a calumet like this, I don't think it would have meant much. But again, that's not the way Hollywood looks at it. They see peace pipe everywhere. But the most curious thing about Louis Joliet, and this is something, again, grave explorers must suffer from, I don't know. On his way back, he had passed through about 50 or 48 of the 50-some raiders in the Chine River. His crew had asked him to portage around this next one, but he wanted to get back in a big hurry, so they tried to shoot. Everything capsized over. The slave that he was given as an adopted son drowned. All of the records of the trip were lost, every bit of them. He was literally sued by his creditors as he came back because the voyage was ostensibly for money, furs and profit. That's what the creditors backed him for. They weren't out for exploration. He was out for exploration. The governor of New France was out for exploration, but his creditors were out for a profit. They sued him. He was considered himself an abject failure for the longest time. And yet our history books they talk about him, but he himself felt a failure. But it's kind of an odd quirk about these great explorers and heroes and how we learn about them in a sentence or a paragraph, and yet they're much deeper than that, all of them. But this is not a decorated one. This is just one I carved out of nothing. It has no significance. Pipestone, if anybody's familiar with Pipestone, Minnesota, pipestone comes from there, and you can file it and chisel. And you can literally get it to this high polish with nothing more than sandpaper, files, and chisels. And it's normally decorated with feathers, and it's probably almost gilding the lily. It's so well decorated. But this was a very universal sign in our area. And what is very interesting is how French traders, being good businessmen, picked up on this. English and French traders came up with this as a trade item. Notice the similarity. It's a smoking axe. You smoking? There's the pipe stem, there's the pipe bowl. Functionally, has no value. This wouldn't last very long to chop anything. But notice, and these could be so fancy, brass with the heart, hollowed out heart in the middle. But you can see how people pick up on it's like consumer's taste. Here it is. This is the traditional pipe which took them long times to carve, had very deep meaning. This, neat match. You are now providing them with something they could get for no more than a beaver club. And again, this was used as a bribe. Just like today. You want an influence in a tribal group? First of all, you kept the old expression, you keep your ear to the ground. You were very observant to figure out who had influence. Not always was the chief. Sometimes it was a person who could talk to the chief or could talk to the influential people who had the gift of gab. And you bribed them. You gave them something. Of course, you mentioned that. You went up and presented them with a gift. Now, this made them very special, but also it sort of made them pliable. And you suddenly were doing things to gain influence. No different. Something I always say is human behavior really doesn't change. It's the things we act out the behavior with that change. In other words, technology. The bribery was, and bribery probably goes back to Babylonian courts and all this. I mean, it's nothing new. But it's interesting how they sort of hit upon this, come to this, and suddenly they were making something similar to this, but making this fancy, beautifully polished thing. It caught everyone's eye. So knowing your markets was just as important back then as it is today. But one of the things that probably reaped the most change was something like this. Now if you imagine that stone axe here and what it could do, the limited function of the stone axe versus this. When this first got into, there's an expression from one of the chiefs. Now, obviously when it's copied in English and translated sometimes, he states that the minute that this came into the hands of the Native Americans, we had hold of the Iron Age. Now this became a radical change in the culture. Along with the Jesuits hitting you from the spiritual end, the technological end was hitting you. It was a bombardment of things hitting you. This made life just totally different. And this is only one of many of the things. What this did was it gave people free time. It gave people what they commonly call in psychology safety needs. Safety needs being your food, clothing, shelter. It allowed them to meet their safety needs in less time. That makes you evolve up to things like aesthetics. And what was happening to the tribal groups was they were getting time, something that was never there before, because every day was basically trying to keep you had to continuous. Everything was rotated by the seasons dictated everything to you. The seasons dictated when to hunt, when to plant, when to harvest, when to go out and gather and do all these things. Suddenly time. And what you were seeing from the tribal groups, after the contact was made and after these goods were exchanged, you were starting to see expressions of art. Again, art is usually expressed in a culture that has met their safety needs. Some of them. This is probably, I mean, this is as artistic as any. You know, I mean, it takes that eye to see something like this. You know, it's like a sculptor who sees in a block of stone his statue already. They say indeed even a wood carver with a paddle can look at a piece of wood and already see the paddle in it. But this was allowing them time to do things that wasn't always available to them. So they were now into the aesthetic part of their life. More so, that's not to say they did not have an artistic bent before, but this allowed them time to really express it. They did not have to put it in such tight time constraints. And again, they started to, some of the trade items. This is very significant in the Ojibwa culture, the turtle, silver turtle. This is a replica of a Hudson's Bay silver gorget. Hudson's Bay used a beaver as a symbol often. And it's got the HB up there. It was worn. Sometimes if you have ever been to a powwow, you could see 4 or 5 of these coming down. Literally worn near the gorget, the silver gorget. You can see as the trade, once they acquired the necessities of life, they started to look at things that no longer were necessities, like gorget and all of these things. And another item that came into being, and this was big in the fur trade, twist tobacco. Around here, obviously tobacco was a North American plant. It wasn't brought from Europe. And they used to grow a plant around here called Nicotinica rustica. That was the brand that was grown around here. There were others in different parts of the country. It also made tobacco out of natural materials, like mixing sumac leaves and the inner bark of the red osier dogwood. If you've ever seen a little bush, red stems all coming out of it, white flowers at a certain time of the year, the dogwood bush, red. They used to get the inner bark, toast that, mix it with the red sumac leaves. If you know in the fall how sumac gets flaming red, and make a knickknack. It's one of the types of knickknack. But this became a very big item. And what happened was the English got control of the Brazilian tobacco trade, and that gave them a better chance of trading, and they were squeezing the French out. And the English and French were continuously in a battle for currying favor or for trade rights or to who was going to get what. And this was one of the items the English basically controlled, the Brazilian black tobacco. They used to bring along in things called a carrot of tobacco, which was on a long spindle, a rope of tobacco. Long rope of tobacco, and dole it out in ropes. I don't know if they say smoking a rope today. Anything like something like that. Here's another one of those items that were great pride. This is a Queen Anne pistol. It's a black powder pistol, circa 1650, a flintlock black powder pistol. But if you notice the fancy butt work and on it, it'll tell you that this pistol was probably not used in a serious manner. It was more of a ceremonial thing. You can imagine going to someone in a tribe and be at the chief and giving them a gift of this. And this person walks around with this, maybe not fully understanding the technology, obviously, but having this piece of shiny, beautiful brass work that makes a nice, you know, that you can literally, it's not very good for hunting, but it certainly is an attention getter. And you probably have, you've got yourself in with it. But just, I try to put this in a context where in a more human context. In other words, these were not just trade items. Many times they were bribes, influence. There were a lot of different things for it. And another thing that was brought here was a very easy way to make fire with flint and steel. And which this, in conjunction with a piece of burned cloth, and see if we can, we've got to sink this a little bit better. If you hit this just right, you got what makes this is sort of, and you could relate this to the miniaturization that we have in our society as things keep shrinking in size. This was a miniaturized version. This was the most portable way to carry fire. You now, in one little tiny sack, could carry a reliable source of fire everywhere with you. In any kind of weather, you can make a fire. You did not have to carry all this cumbersome stuff where this could break, or if it gets wet, it loses some of its friction tendency. You have now a new, very reliable source of fire, and this was another big trade item. I mean, you know, it's like today, my son can walk around with a little tiny thing strapped around his head, listening to every station in the world, where when I was a kid, you know, the transistor came around when I was, I think, about 11 or 12, and it was like, I never, you know, the greatest thing in my life. But before that, there's a big tube radios, and we used to sit around this big old, I grew up at the end of radio, our radio plays. Gene Autry was, when I was a little tiny boy, my mother would tuck me in bed, and we'd turn on Gene Autry, just before it all switched over to television. And it was like this humongous machine, you know, like an old computer, as big as that. But miniaturization, and they took to this immediately because, again, it made their life easier. Very easy thing. Something that I've got here, and I thought I'd talk about it. I'm going to try to get over to this end. A little bit on foods and medicines, because it's kind of interesting to see how over trial and error or period they learn things. Something that is still very viable today. This is the juice of a jewelweed plant. And what it was used for was to alleviate the sting of poison ivy and stinging nettle. It still works much the same today. However, you must first know it must be growing in the place you're walking, and secondly, you have to know how to recognize it. And they did, and they would squeeze out the juice. And what it alleviated was the symptoms of poison ivy. What was going on inside was still going on, but the symptoms, the itch, was being alleviated. And same for stinging nettle. Stinging nettle, this worked very well, very quickly in stinging nettle, but they knew this, and it does indeed have true fungicidal properties. This has been tested in modern science. And another little item, it's made from the plant called the jewelweed, which is an impatient species called touch-me-not. The reason it gets its name is because when you touch the capsule on its right, it blows the seeds out. It grows normally along borders of floodplains. It's an annual plant, hollow except at the joints where the leaves come out, and it grows about 8 feet high. About this time of year, it's at probably maximum growth, and you'll see it with one of the most beautiful flowers. It's a little spurred hook, orange with little red speckled dots on it. It's like a horn. It looks like a Victrola, or the old gramophone horn. Yeah, and it just, it really worked. We had a person who caught a little poison ivy. They were red, very sensitive skin. And we took the plants, cut them, and put it down there, and it did alleviate the itch long enough for him to get home and put hydrocortisone. Another interesting thing is cattail pollen. This is from the male flower head of the cattail. The cattail grows with a, let's see if we've got one here in the, I think there's one over here. Yeah. when they grow, you find the female part here, which is the part called, that we normally see. On top is where the male flower head grows with pollen. And in and around the second and third week of June, the male flower ripens. And the pollen is harvestable. And they used to harvest this pollen, and it was used as a dye. It was also used to make a hardtack type biscuit. Today, people harvest it to make pancake batter. And it'll be available. You can literally open it up and touch it. It has no real taste, but you can touch it. It feels as fine as chalk does. It was used for that purpose. Another big item, the cattail down. When you peel this flower head, it comes into a down thing. They used to literally line the baby's leather diapers with this as a disposable agent. The pillow that I passed around is loaded with cattail down. They made games that were with cattail down stuffing. So cattail, in many ways, in fact, there are a few more I'm going to show. They would take these and dip it in rendered animal fat to make torches. And these, literally, depending upon the size and the amount of dipping you do, can last for hours. And they light up the night, something beautiful. We do with these sometimes in our back house. We'll go out at night, light 2 or 3 of these, stick them in the ground, and sort of sit there with them as our light, if we don't have a light back. And they literally are like tiki torches, say, which you pay all that money for. And a tiki torch is nothing more than a wick with what, vegetable oil or something in it. But they used to use it for that also. Probably the biggest use of cattail was in shelter. And again, the generic Indian is always in a wig or in a teepee, but the shelter around here was called a wigwam. And one of the coverings, they used to take saplings, put them in the ground, arch them together, lash them, and make a sort of superstructure that would have to be covered. And one of the coverings up north was birch bark. One of the best coverings for a wigwam. It really works well. However, when you're living in Illinois down here, that isn't available. Another covering that is excellent covering is elm bark. And long before the bark beetle came with the fungus on its leg, there was plenty of American elm here, and they would literally cover with slabs of elm bark. An excellent winter covering. But a third covering, which is the least effective, was cattail leaves sewn together. If I could have a volunteer to help me peel this, get it all undone, would you? Okay. These are individual leaves sewn together. Now this was woman's work again. But the reward for this was, in the Algonquian culture, the females owned the shell. So but here's the other drawback, besides making it, the females were basically responsible for transporting it. And the leaves of the cattail are what, you have sort of a trade-off here. You get abundance of material, and you get lightweight, but you get non-durable material as a trade-off. Okay, these are as abundant as can be, but they are not durable. One season is if you get 2 seasons out of a cattail mat, you are darn lucky. And having made these, I can tell you, they just do not take well. And in a heavy rainstorm, you can take a shower inside. So I've got a quote from a Jesuit priest. It's a book called The Indians of Kendall County, and he talks about this thing leaking like a sieve in a rainstorm. But what we can do is, if you will be willing to be my subject, we'll let you carry one to show you the likeness of it. Okay? And you can imagine sewing this. And my mat is made to conform to transporting in my car. They are many times bigger and longer. You can see how light it is to carry. I'll give you a... Oh, sure. It's a feather. Yeah. That was your trade-off. You transportability, but non-durability. And the women would sit there, and this is where this type of needle comes in. You take your sinew, or the cord you were using, and you would go through the cattail, but you would try to get sandwiched between the 2 layers. So what you were doing was, you did not want the rope to show through. If you notice, for the most part, the rope is going through. You put it through. And the needle is this long to allow you to go through 3/4 at a time. Pull through, ducks are sewing. Normally, each line going through is one hand distance apart. At least this is what they say. This could, you know, I'm sure it wasn't consistent everywhere, but the strings were about a hand distance apart, and they were as long as 20 feet, maybe longer, and some much higher many times. Mine fits my car, that's the only compromise. But imagine as young girls and females of the tribe sitting there. This time of year is when this business got big. The activity of making mats got big this time of year. Imagine females doing this consistent. All you get up in the morning, and the only thing you have to look forward to is this and this. You can see why, when this came along, canvas, suddenly a new house cover. Suddenly females did not have to do, they would sometimes make a base row of these, what was called a wall mat, one row around, but the covering could now be bought or traded for. Again, a dramatic change, along with a dramatic change in just that. Something that is so mundane today, I don't know if I can find it in my little thing, but I'll dig it out. One of the most mundane things to us today, needle and thread. No more bones, no more smashing cinnamon on a rock, a needle and thread. It was making changes. You look at the, you know, we can look at this today, and we can look at this, and look at these little items, and to us, they have very low priority. They are so abundant, available. They have low priority. I mean, needle and thread. Everybody probably can go home and dig up 20 spools of thread and probably abundant amount of needles. And book of matches. Probably any guy here can pull out a book of matches. They're common. We don't, and they give them away today. You go anywhere. The fire that these people paid for with furs is given away today. So it's kind of the perspective. And to kind of close this up and bring this full circle, the traders came here to get the furs, of which the prime fur, and I probably just locked in one of these spots here. Here it is. You were looking at something that you could consider as good as gold in the time, and in fact it was called the soft brown gold. But the odd thing was, they came not so much to get this skin. Believe it or not, they came to get the inner hairs of this beaver. Not the guard hairs, the inner hairs. And if you've got time, come on up and sort of separate the hairs. Look at the inner hairs. Under about 800 power magnification, you find that the hairs are scaly. And this is what caused the beaver to almost become extinct. Just nothing more than the fact that his inner hairs were scaly. And it was the male pelt that was the most valuable. What happened was they came here to get this because, believe it or not, and this is, we all know something about fashion, how it's conforming to fashion trends. Okay? If you've got children or you've raised children over time, and most of us have, you know that they have to conform to something. The newest thing out, they got to have it because, hey, they're all wearing it in school, and I will feel like I'll feel strange when I don't have it. The hat, the gentleman's hat was the height of fashion. To go out in public without your hat was as if, I don't know what we could liken that to today. Probably to go to a formal affair with a pair of Bermudas and gym shoes. So what came along though was they needed a hat that would allow a man, a fine gentleman, to go out in inclement weather. They found that by shaving the hair off of the inner fur off of the beaver, mashing it down and working it, they could make a felt to cover a hat and make a fine gentleman's hat waterproof from any weather, so that he would never have to go out without that one accessory that made him, and then her, because women wore this, a fine person, the beaver fur. So this guy was dying. A culture was literally being totally reversed and changed because of fashion. What they would have called, the French would call, alpha son de fashion of the country. This guy became you look at the beaver fur, probably, and some of these trade goods as the instruments of total cultural upheaval. It looks so mundane. A lousy kit of fire, a needle and thread, and a big giant rat. It's all beaver. The rodent, big old rat. So what happened is, you can look at, for a country and for a culture, we have a rat and a hat going kind of full circle around. And this, today we went over to Iraq to fight ostensibly to get rid of a bad guy and give the Sheiks back their throne and their BMW. Okay. But I think it had more to do with resource than anything. That the most valuable resource on this earth today, as far as how we live, is oil. Because it is the backbone, the engine, it is everything. Back then, in those days, to the Native Americans, the resource that would determine how they were going to live once the traders came was this. And the Iroquois, who were one of the first to meet the Dutch and trade with them, had trapped out all the, in that country the beaver were rather short, small beaver, but not, they trapped it out. Their lifeblood, their continuation of this evolution of culture depended upon getting more of this. So a lot of the Iroquois marches were not marches of conquest, they were marches of resource, to grab a resource they no longer had. But what's so important to their livelihood, they had much like we no longer have much oil. So it's the most important thing to our livelihood. When it's threatened, even though it's someone else's, we're there to make sure our share is still around. The same thing. And it sort of just relates back to people do not change. The behavior of people rarely changes. It stays pretty much the same. Those emotions, love, hate, anger, greed, they were here from the days of Adam and Eve on down. I mean, they've always been here. And this was much the same. This was an engine of change. And I think I'll leave you with one thing before I go. And I didn't even get to the garden tools in case I was going to talk about this is the 8 hardware store thing of the day. It's a shoulder bone hoe. And digging sticks, nothing more. I can thank one of the beavers where I live in Osabo Creek for doing, other than the facing here, all the chewing of the bark and making me a nice candle. Compliments of the beaver there. And this, which we didn't get to, was a rake. Putting the antler tines together, joining them, lashing them with rawhide, your friendly garden rake. And your ladle for watering, gourd. So it's kind of all this. But I thought I'd leave you with one little sort of thing, and maybe sort of for you to, I'll give you if we can find it. I always sort of end with this. And this is, I think, kind of what sums this up and sums all of this up. What makes this, to Native Americans, better than, what would make this better than this? And it has absolutely nothing to do with physical property.
One's nature, one's man-made.
Well, they're both man-made, if you think about it.
Yeah, but that start,
Yeah, the only difference is, they're both starting as this starts as an or, okay? But think of something that we can relate to today because we are linked in this same chain.
A weapon.
And it has nothing to do with physical property. It has everything to do with what we are today.
The energy to make those. The energy you need to make those.
Think in deeper terms. Think of something. What really makes this is intrinsic to any culture, what happens to us over time.
modernization.
Huh?
Modernization?
But what made this better than this? From the standpoint of the tribal people. Why would, and this is almost, I'm almost contradicting myself, right? And then, but think deeper than physical property. It has nothing to do with physical property as much as it has to do with history.
Kept them all together because with that stone, they were all involved into stuff. But once you freed up their free time, you gave them an article where they weren't concentrating and being together. Now they can do other things like kill each other and stuff like that.
It's very good. In fact, this kept them independent. It kept them attached to the environment they lived in. This is a technology they not only could use, they understood. This is a technology that made them dependent, detached them from the land. They could use it. They could not understand how to make it. Think of us today. Very few of us understand the pieces of our technology. We all know how to drive a car. We all know how to use a computer, but few of us know know the intricacies of it. We are as dependent on technology today as they became. We are just up the chain a little bit. And we have no attachment to the land anymore. They had none in the end either. And both, but I'm not putting this in any moralistic sense. I'm just saying this is what happens to all cultures. But as he pointed out, the closeness they had was lost. Just like today, we can go to the McDonald's order window and eat in our car, turn on our radio. We're in our own little world there, and nobody can disturb us if we don't want to. We don't have to. We do not have to socialize with anybody today, except at work. We're forced in certain constraints. But when we're out of work, we don't have to see another person. We can go to McDonald's. We can go home and with a video cassette, and we're cocooned for life. So very good. That's a very big point from a little point, but that's about all I can say. I'm going to leave this out here. Some of it's a little messed up by me grabbing it, but you're welcome to grab and hold, do whatever you want with it here. We didn't get to everything, but yes.
Up on the Mississippi, there's a French trader's port, and they mentioned that the beaver was the number one, like you mentioned, and then they went down to like the mink and the bear, and if you wanted a blanket, you had to give them 3 beavers, but if you wanted that same blanket and only had bear, you might have to give them 10 bear furs to equal 1 beaver.
Exactly.
The equation was astronomical.
It was everything was related to beaver furs. Everything. The value of a bear was put in beaver furs. Only animal that had more value than the beaver was an otter, and that's because there wasn't very many of them. But the blankets, at one time they used to have points, which meant price. But once inflation came, believe it or not, that term was creeping up long ago. That all that those points meant to a Native American was size and weight. In other words, a 4-point blanket might weigh 5 pounds, be 72 inches by 90. Now, obviously, they didn't have in their mind 72 by 90, but they knew in their head the size and the weight, because inflation came and those 4 points were nothing more than symbolic of something else. But indeed, you're right. That's a very good point.
Is there an Indian museum in Chicago area that is worth visiting?
There's a couple. There's the Illalakosh in Romeoville on 135th Street. Romeoville is on 135th, east of the junction of 135th Street and Illinois Route 53. You just go east for half a mile, and you turn right, and it's right there. It's a free museum, no charge, and it's not open Mondays, open the rest of the week. You could, let's see if it's still available. I would recommend, if you wanted to get into Native Americans that not necessarily were part of already here, if you've not visited the Pawnee Earth Lodge, but there's a display. The Hall on Native Americans in the Field Museum covers a lot, and if you've got time to peruse that, it's excellent. They also have an area where you can rent videotapes, not rent them. You can take out videotapes and go to a little room. There's a tape on Iroquois dancing where they teach the dancing. On games, you can do a lot. You can sit there. Now this requires time because, literally if you go to the Field Museum, I mean, you talk 4 hours is minuscule at that museum. I mean, depending, unless you're focusing. If you're going to see the whole place, 4 hours is nothing. But that's another one. Now, there is a museum that deals somewhat tangent to the Indians, but a lot on the history afterwards, is the LaSalle County Historical Society in Utica. As you're going to Starved Rock, in Utica, there where you get that turnout, well, as you're heading out to Starved Rock, there's a little museum. One corner is Duffy's Tavern, the other corner is the LaSalle Historical Society Museum. That's another nice place to view. They concentrate a lot on Lincoln, but they do work back to a few of the things. They have a display on the reenactment of the LaSalle voyage. If you recall, that was done in the Joliet voyage. That's another neat little museum. They have the carriage Lincoln rode in, all kinds of nice stuff. But that sort of moves Illinois history off a bit. I'm trying to think of another good Native American museum. I don't know. Has anybody come across a place where you can go where it's not, the cost is not prohibitive? You probably were at Fort Sharp.
It was on the Mississippi,
Down southern, right?
yeah, no, it's rough near,
We went up the Mississippi River.
near La Crosse, Wisconsin. We
It
went
was
to
a fort,
was a
and the
fort.
presidents were generals, but next to it was a French
Well,
fur trader.
We were on what was left of the fort,
Okay.
where they had it was a French fur trading post first, and then it was an American fort, and then I guess the
Went there
Indians
to the British.
during the, I think this is during the War of 1812 is what was significant. The they joined forces again back with the British to come down and, to come down in Illinois and of course cause trouble.
That was real nice. They showed pictures.
They had to,
Well, there, no, obviously, Starved Rock is,
Very small in Black Hawk State Park.
right, yeah. Black Hawk is one of the very interesting character, probably in our area, one of the last, of the warrior chiefs. Black Sparrow Hawk was his full name. Interesting how he died, his head was cut off and by grave robbers and put in a circus tent, all kinds of unusual things. But in that skirmish called the Black Hawk War, there were people like Abraham Lincoln, who was a militiaman in that conflict, kind of unusual. Probably more unusual, and throw one last piece of history at you, is during the so-called French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, whatever you want to call it, one battle involved two famous people in the same battle, Washington and Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone was the wagon master in this great retreat, which was called Braddock's Defeat. Washington was one of the colonels who advised against some of the tactics used by General Braddock and was not listened to, and almost lost his life. They had 3 horses shot out from under him in the battle. When you think about the so-called father of our country being killed in that battle, what happened from there? What would have happened? Would we be going like this? Oh, today, Blondie, old boy, how are you today? You know, interesting. And they say that from that defeat, Potawatomi took horses back and introduced them for the first time to the Illinois country, which again made drastic changes in lifestyle, the guns and all that. What I didn't have time to put up for you today, the convenience device used in that time called the travois. You're familiar with that French word, the travois, the dragging device? That's a dog travois there, because dogs were, in this country, they were pets, food, sacrifices, and beasts of burden, all the things. But that, I didn't have time by 7:30 to get that up, but this is another female thing for you. It's a wood carrier. Put on the back with a, and there's a, with this strap called the tump line, you put it across your head and tie it to the back. There's a wood carrier. Nothing more than 4 pieces of wood. Backpack of its time. If any more questions, otherwise I will shut up. I've said plenty already. Okay. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. It's one of the most enjoyable talks we've had in a long time. We have refreshments over here. Thank you.
You know, you can look and see the expression in 2 different cultures, the same thing. Arrows, this is, you're talking about, extended out all the way to the twigs, you can take a bone or a stone knife and cut it down. It's a super soft bone. In fact, it's basically semi-rotted.
Hi, Dolores. Dolores, I want you to meet Margie. How you been? I didn't know that. Oh, no. Bad time, Dolores.
All you need to do is lock arms to your legs so you're not wobbling, and grab from behind.
Yeah. Wow.
Created to help turn pages.
Yeah.
And I got a turn pages for them. And so I kind of looked down at the audience to see if anybody else noticed it.
Wood, always, but a soft wood, here's the key. Wood has to rot dead on the tree, not on the ground. You dry rot, wet rot. There's a fingernail mark in there.
Yeah.
It stays. It's usually about the right season. If you put a mark in too easy, it's overseasoned. Or if you can't, this is seasoned enough for that type of fish. But on the tree, this area, they would do, let's see, I'll show you, we can do it that way here. Watch how fast this process, to show you what I'm talking power drill. Watch what happens. This is like a Black & Decker versus this hand drill, which was, you know, the old cranker that we have today. But that's all it took. Yeah, easy stuff. And I didn't even talk about wampum. This is real wampum. They still make it on the Iroquois Reservation. What they do today is to compromise. They dye the white purple because the purple is so rare you can't get it. That's made from the conch shell. And it's still made up there today, but they won't make the purple anymore, so they'll dye. What they tell you to do now is dye it yourself. That's basically what you call them up. They say dye it yourself. But they used to fracture it, then smooth it with sand and use tiny quartz slivers to drill a hole.
Versus that stone?
Yeah, exactly. And once you've got the technique down on this, you can see in 15 seconds you got a nice hot hole and raring for a fire. But you can give that a try if you like. This could be any type of wood. The softwoods I would recommend are cedar, basswood, silver maple, cottonwood, willow. All of your softwoods. But how did the Indians get this? Oh, the conch was Eastern, and this stuff came in through the intertribal trade route. They did use them for some of the purposes. The thing about those shells I have on that up there for digging. They used for the purple, the big went called the quahog, which had a purple lining. That's where the valuable purple came from, which they won't be doing. That's kind of more difficult. But what this was significant for was this recorded a significant event outside history. Wampum bells were historical recordings. People were trying to memorize the bell because they could read back point for point on a wampum bell what had happened a year earlier. Special event. That's what the bells were for. These are nothing more than wampum strings, but made into bells. They were history recorders. Much like this records our history. And they did it with wampum. Some of the most... Well, there were people called insiders whose job was to string a bell to memorize it for what had happened. So they would make the bell. And as they made it, the different varieties of patterns and colors would indicate some part of that event. And at the end, when they finished it, that'll hold the spark and start laminating. Then you wrap this in the nest with lawn. You've got a fire. They call that a nest. What it is it's grass and jute twine all in cotton bark just rolled together. And you make what they call a nest out of it. Yeah, if you're doing it right, it's not as difficult as it looks. It really isn't. It's not research right now. No, I spent 10 years working in the Native American Museum. And it started from there. I used to do great individual programs, but my son was an athlete and actually did it. And over a period of 10 years, there was a lot of failure. Where did you work? A lot of times. No, that was yeah, their items, the bow or the hand drill. Became a trade item along with all the other metal items. And of course, things like looking at it, and it's composite gravel like like there's a gravel road, look for the stuff that's whiter, chunkier white looking than the other gravel. That's sometimes you find the black stuff, but more often than not you'll find a hunch like this, or smaller hunch. Even a hunch as tiny as little flakes can make a spark on there because it's sharp. This is more durable. This is gunflint, or firing a gun. It's a little more durable than the churty stuff. But, I could have ordered all that. I brought the book that normally I bring the but this is a book. Dragging two clumps together. Yeah, that's a big one. Real good, so you don't hit hands. Okay. This is a book that has a lot of these. I don't know if this one. Good, if I'm not mistaken. You start fires like that? What do you do, okay? When I go, I use a fireball. Oh, really? Yeah, for me, it's the one I like best, and it's always worked well for me. I make it, so I'm familiar with the technology. It doesn't bother me. I know it's here. It takes a bit of time. Well, there should be more than one book here that indicates all that and where they all go. My phone number is 655-467.
These must be some of these shells.
It's going to be, if you're near, it's going to be the Aiello Hill on there. I'm going to be able to dig it. With a hole. Here's the other buffalo one attached. This is the hole and the rake, which I didn't attach. The buffalo shoulders I got from taxidermy. Obviously, I wouldn't be able to find them, but he sells the shoulder bones. I got the antlers by just simply heading out in January. Heading out in January, what I did was I smashed it with my rock to get it there, and then used my sandstone to file the head down. I literally crushed it up with my pounding stone so it fit my piece of basswood that I found in the woods. And basswood's very flexible to make the front end of it. And this is hardwood, top and bottom. Normally this is wetted and stretched, but obviously I'm trying to let it dry. But when it's shed, I go over to a stable and through the woods, and if I'm lucky, I'll come across one or two, and I'll take them home with me, and there's more in here somewhere. There's another generous and I'll use the time for napping, sometimes for a pocket, and for rake. So you just go out in January when they're shedding. You normally never buy two together, but you just sort of, if it's a warm enough January day, the wood is easy to penetrate, or easy to penetrate. You just keep on pushing the pepper every wood, and there's enough I go out and I look, deer paths are easy to follow in the summer because you can see where in the long, tall undergrowth there's just beautiful paths. So I'll pull along there in the summer. In the wintertime, what I'll do is I'll just get my son and sort of like doing a curse path. Where the deer would want to go and the browse lines down there. Occasionally you find one with the blood on it, so No, the buckeye is a small, it's the Ohio, there's in the family of buckeye, you got the sweet buckeye, the Ohio buckeye. They're a little something like, I think of it like an acorn hanging off the tree, but a little bit different shape. And then there's another one which is an introduced species. It's not called a buckeye, and it's horse chestnut. They're all related. I forget the genus that it's over, but this is the buckeye. This is a member of the bean family. Buckeye is a member of the bean family. But the Kentucky poppy tree you'll find planted along the expressway, and because the soil, so along, you'll see at this time of year, the pods are green. Where I live over in Minnesota, they're all planted at the corner of the you just go over there and fall, but you have to rotate the coffee out of it. Miles of time. And these are the beans that come out of there. People call them banana fruits, but you know, they look like a small banana. But they're normally found along the expressway right away. Well, they might look like a buckeye, the fruit. The buckeye tree itself is a totally different species. It's a big leafy tree with like 5 leaflets, palm-shaped, whereas this is long, but they're easy to get. Like, I can get almost any prairie plant. I don't pick them, but the railroad right-of-ways have some of the last version prairie remnants. You walk along the railroad right-of-way. By my house right now, there's blazing star, there's wild bergamot, there's fruit gentian, there's all these plants that right along the railroad, 100 yards from the road where people are driving. Here are these rare prairie plants, but nobody knows. I just go over there and sort of admire them. I take a little count in my head. I say, oh, that one, because they're too rare to hit. Well, I enjoyed the biology doing more of it. You have to do this different world. Well, yeah, I find my wife, you should see my house. Cattails, bones, the garage is full of the bark, razor stripping cord. It's just loaded in layers there. When people come over to my house, I first have to explain all this. Why that in the corner there's a mound ketchup, or there's a big skull. You have to literally explain it. My father, you know, he finds this very hard to tell because he said, what's that word?
No, but you're a fabulous teacher, though.
On Thursday, September 3rd, the Matteson Historical Society had a guest speaker at the Community Center Conference Room. Those who attended learned about the life of area Indians before European contact.
But I thought I'd give you a perspective of what was happening back then from a few things. One, maybe from a standpoint of technology. And this will interest the women, I think, mostly because, believe it or not, I'll just name you some of the tasks performed by women in a tribe. Skinning animals, cutting up and drying the meat, getting the firewood, making the lodge, transporting the lodge, taking care of the children, making the clothes, making the thread for the clothing, tending the gardens, probably sundry other tasks. Now, the men's basic tasks were hunting, fishing, some of the more muscular tasks that obviously women weren't physically capable of performing, smoking, war councils, and laying around for a lot. Hollywood has shortchanged females in history, and especially Native American females, because have you ever seen a movie that concentrated on a Native American woman as the backbone of a tribe? Probably, you may have seen some points, but nothing that concentrated on that. They were literally the backbone of a tribe. But Hollywood doesn't find that very interesting, so the movies we get almost always center around warfare. But I thought I'd start with some of the technology of the time. And here's another one of those words that sounds like a contradiction, technology, but here's some of the technology. This would be very germane to the females in the audience. That's a skinning knife, or a gutting knife of the time. It's a stone knife made of flint with an antler handle with hide glue wrapped in rawhide. The animal would many times be tied
by the legs over a tree branch and then gutted. And you would start slicing for the skin, and then use your hands. As anybody who's skinned an animal knows, the hands are as good as a tool for when the skin starts peeling off. They would have to literally gut the animal and make sure the skin quality was intact, cut the meat off, smoke and dry the meat, save the bones, and then start working on clothing, because the women made all the clothing. You can see now that this is never shown in movies, all the work that was done by women. They would start the clothing making by having to get rid of the hair off of a hide, and there were a couple ways of doing it. Occasionally they'd use what was called a beaming board, which was a board on a couple of legs laid on about, say, a 45-degree angle. And this would go over it, the fur, and then they would take another one of the tools of the trade, a scrape. This is a shaving tool. They would first flesh off the blood and guts. Okay, and there's a couple of types of fleshing tools. They'd flesh off the blood and guts, then they would have to scrape the hide with this, literally shave off most of the hair. So this item became the shaving tool. It's a deer shoulder bone or scapula used for a scraper. And you can imagine how long this took just for one individual hide. And it took more than one hide to make a shirt or a skirt or a breechcloth, leggings, all of this. So this is a section of moose hide. And obviously moose is not native to our area, but some man's wife was threatening to throw him out. He gave this to me, and I use it as a demo. The kids, when we do this work with kids, we give them the tools and let them go to work. This is their handiwork. This is children just with this bone tool. They've done a nice job. If I get it far enough gone, I'd probably be able to use it. But this was only the start. Getting the hair off, getting the blood and guts off. And of course, doing it without damaging the skin, because that skin was the key. You didn't want to wear a shirt with moose hair all over it, because I guarantee you, it won't be a pleasant experience. But once you've done that, you've got to do a few things. One, you've got to stretch your hide, because you want the maximum amount of surface area for what you're getting. So you soak and you stretch the hide, and you stretch the hide. You may stake it down even and stretch it, because what you're trying to do is not have to do 3 of these if you don't have to. But probably the most unique thing, or I don't know if you can have most unique, but probably the unique thing about it is they discovered that the brain of the animal would tan the hide. And the woman would have to take, usually it was a hammerstone, one probably that fit the individual person's hand. This is a hammerstone. And bust the skull open, take out the brains, put it in, normally the bowl was something like this, a gourd bowl, because pre-contact in our area, there was no metal. Get the brain in here, mix it with some water, and then rub it on both sides of the skin. Because what they were doing, they were coating the skin fibers with oils from the brains. Much like when we have dry skin and we rub in skin lotion, we're coating the fibers of our skin. That was to coat the fibers of the skin so that it would become soft. And see if we have a hunk of the material here. Let's see, this is this material here, which is a pillow, by the way. Oddly enough, Western people didn't invent the pillow. They would coat the fibers so it would be soft, and then they would start working on the sewing part of it. If they failed to do that, this is what you get if you don't tin it. You get rawhide, parflesh. You can imagine a breechcloth made of this. A little squirmy. However, this was one of those universal, had a multitude of uses, but that was brain tanning. Now you can, that process there probably took a day, and they were nowhere near a shirt. After that, they had to kind of go along, and after brain tanning, you had to wash it, then you had to stretch it again, then you rubbed it to get the softness back in it, and you had then to start cutting and sewing. And of course, you didn't have thread. What you did, you took the tendons of the animal. This is called back sinew, deer back sinew. The back tendons that run along the spine. They took them out, and the process, using the bone or the stone knife, they would get just behind it, start slicing and cutting, get your fingers in, and start pulling the sinew down off the long back sinew, because the longer piece you got, the easier it was to sew. Once you got it off, you had to start busting up the bundle sheaths that hold these together with a rock on a hard surface, and they would just start pounding. And slowly but surely, getting thinner and thinner pieces. Do you see almost like thread coming out of this? If you can, this is thread. This would take quite a bit of time, effort, and then to splice the thread is very tricky. This was the thread of its time. Now, how they came about brain tanning in this, obviously it had to be through just, there was not unique to the 1600 Native Americans. This goes back probably to prehistoric man as far back as, we have no record of that. But this was the thread, and yet, again, we have not come to anything, after the man dropped that hunted animal off, we haven't come to anything they've been doing yet, because they haven't been doing anything. After the thread was done, they had to then get themselves, make a few more tools, if they didn't already have them. One was an awl. They had to punch the holes in the leather to sew it. And normally the shirts made for men usually were loosely sewn along the arms and then just tied with cord here. Because there are times when if you were hunting or if you needed the use of your full extent of your arms, you could untie and unlace the cord and toss the sleeve out under you. And along the sides, it wasn't sewn normally. It was just corded with thong, so that you had a loose shirt, very loose. There was no great tailoring of the time, very loose fitting, but very functional shirt. But to get through the leather, you had to have a sharp instrument. This is a bone awl. It's nothing more than a filed deer bone. And when they made tools out of deer bones, they literally had to read the bone. You look for the fracture lines, because the fracture lines are going to tell you where to hammer it, to start working on a sliver or a piece that's going to eventually look like this. You take your hammerstone, hit it along the fracture lines. Once you've got your piece, you start using your sandstone. And can you imagine the time consumed in filing this down on sandstone? Imagine how long just to get one of these. So this was how they had to know how to literally read that bone. Because if you just smash it with a hammer in the wrong place, you get a bunch of tiny little bones, which, great for a dog if you have one, and they did have them. Yes?
What is the fracture line? Is that something that they created?
No. In every bone, normally you can see either suture lines or fracture lines. Just like in a skull is a bunch of fused plates. This, I'll pass this bone around and take a look and you'll see fracture lines in it. Once they punched it through with this, they had to use needles. And again, needles of bone. The sinew would be attached and sewn through with this, a bone needle. And I didn't even get to the garden tools in case I was going to talk about, this is the Ace Hardware store thing of its day. It's a shoulder bone hoe. And digging sticks, nothing more. I can thank one of the beavers where I live in Osable Creek for doing, other than the facing here, all the chewing of the bark and making me a nice handle was compliments of the beaver there. And this, which we didn't get to, was a rake. Putting the antler tines together, joining them, lashing them with rawhide, your friendly garden rake. And your ladle for watering, gourd. So it's kind of all of this. That's about all I can say. I'm going to leave this out here. Some of it's a little messed up by me grabbing it, but you're welcome to grab and hold, do whatever you want with it here.
Thanks for watching this edition of Southward Bound. I'm Lisa Pratty, and I'll see you next month.